right, welcome to HP to XP. It is another day of introducing players to our potential audience. Today we are going to be meeting with Matt, but in keeping with my terrible attempts at humor, we're going to begin with a joke. What's green and fuzzy, and if it falls out of a tree, it'll kill you? Pool table. I love that joke. I'm working on it. Okay, I'm working on material. I'll see what I can come up with. It's all about workshopping things. You gotta workshop stuff, and that's something that we're gonna get to talk about with Matt in a moment here. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and bring him in and have a conversation about these things. So, Matthew, how are you?
Doing well. Good to see you. To everybody else out there as well. It's good to be here. Looking forward to chatting today, and even more to getting ready for the upcoming campaign and potential carnage that we could face on December 16th.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. So, as I mentioned, you are a great guy to talk about material with because stand-up comedy is one of your kind of side gigs, one of your excitements. So how did you get into stand-up?
Actually doing stand-up was something I did therapeutically. It was something that I've always enjoyed, making people laugh, and I've spent a lot of time, and we'll probably discuss this some, working in different situations overseas, some of them very tense, where you would see the results of human conflict on each other. And when I finished one of my last assignments in Turkey and came back and was just feeling a little bit down, I decided to take a stand-up comedy workshop class just as a way to go out and try to regain a little of the joy that is life after going through a period where I'd been a little bit down, and did that, ended up enjoying it, started doing a few open mics here and there. And then from there, every now and then we get invited to a showcase, which is always fun. So yeah, it was good. It was a good way to explore a different part of my personality. I know you had talked with Steph and with others before, but I always started thinking in my head a little bit, and this really, again, this summer even, during the pandemic, just thinking about, when we were in high school or some in college, or for those who went, you still do all these variety of activities, where it's theater or drama or comedy or sport or whatever it is. But you tend to lose that as you transition to adult life because of different work responsibilities and all these things that come up. And it was a way to kind of embrace and take back that part of life that we seem to cede with no reason to. So,
yeah, no, I think that's awesome. I've got several friends who have spent a decent amount of time in stand-up comedy, and they love it. It is, I think it's a really interesting hobby, almost borderline sport, that can be super exciting. I think that it's great for anybody who is looking to get outside of themselves as well, right? You have to get out of your head a little bit if you're going to be on stage, or otherwise you just stand there frozen like a deer in the headlights. So I think that's super interesting. Hello, Sarah's. Hello, Steph. Hello, Friday. Thanks for everybody who is tuning in so far. So you brought it up. Let's go overseas. Why have you spent so much time overseas?
Essentially for 18 years, I've been an American diplomat. I'm actually on an extended leave without pay, and left that as I was transitioning, looking into creating my own nonprofit. But as a result of that work, I often found myself working in the humanitarian refugee sector. So going into areas where there was conflict, for example, like Syria, and then I lived in Turkey for 2 years, overseeing humanitarian assistance, whether it was providing education or food or protection for all sorts of different types of refugees. I'd done similar things in the Balkans, and I'd done some work on that in human rights in Colombia. So I've lived in several countries. I guess I've lived in Colombia, I've lived in Bosnia, I've lived in Afghanistan, I've lived in Turkey, I've lived in Spain, and of course, the United States is my home. So it's given me a variety of experience. It's even been fun. Occasionally, one of the reasons I really got back into Dungeons and Dragons was during my time in Turkey. It was a welcome distraction with some of the expat friends that I had based there. So basically professionally, I kind of went from conflict zone to conflict zone, basically trying to figure out what we could do to help people who are in need.
What got you into foreign service to begin with?
On one hand, I've always been interested in foreign countries and in history. My father was a geography professor, and so looking at maps, I mean, one of the things that probably also draws me to D&D as much is you look at maps and you're exploring the world and you're interested about different cultures. The same things that have drawn me to Dungeons and Dragons in a more fantasy setting are also what drew me into being interested in the diplomatic world. It was going out, representing my country, going out and essentially doing work on things I believe in, trying to make the world a little better place, and also trying to explain at times where I'm coming from and learn from other people where they're coming from, all part of a dialogue.
Sure. And I think that it's interesting. Obviously, you and I have had a chance to talk about this some, but I think it would be interesting for other folks as well. Sort of your last big assignment was dealing with a big hunk of the humanitarian crisis that has come about because of the Syrian civil war. What, obviously digesting that and deconstructing that entire realm is probably an incredibly long conversation and not really the one that we're going to have today. But I do think that it's what do you think having that experience, having been through that experience both as effectively a participant in many ways, being immersed in it, being embedded in it, but also as a helper, what do you think that experience has lent you in day-to-day life? What would you want somebody to know about that experience?
I'd say the first thing is just empathy. So often when you hear about big news stories, and so yes, I went up and opened up the U.S. government's refugee office for the Syrian crisis back in 2014 in Turkey. And I think when you work in these type of scenarios, and humanitarian workers see this a great deal, is that there's definitely empathy, because so often it's just a news story that you kind of flash over. And so I know that sometimes it's hard to communicate that because we get so much news today. Everything is so mass consumed to an extent where we all become numbed a little bit. And it always sometimes takes a graphic image or certain, like the picture of the Syrian child washing up on the beach in Turkey really galvanized the public in a way that we weren't seeing before that and really haven't seen afterwards, because I think all of a sudden people realize how desperate they would have to be to risk that travel in the Mediterranean with their children and what the results could be. And that's a result of the conflict. So I think for me, the first thing is it just gave me an appreciation of what I have. So while I might have been immersed in it to a certain extent, I still had a home with the comforts that we all have. I still had a job and was able to basically live my life free with those concerns. And so being able to see that for me in my everyday life gives me an appreciation of, even when things do go south for you personally, there are always some people who probably have it worse. And therefore having empathy for those people, remembering in our human spirit, as I like to say, that we can do more. And we often do. That I do think as much negativity as sometimes pops around, that there is a core there that still wants to help people, even as we become numbed to it a little bit. So I would say that's one element of something that really affects me in my day-to-day life, is just thinking, as you get older, what can I do to help? How can I make the world a better place than how I found it? Even if it's just a little thing. Sometimes policies succeed, sometimes policies fail. Nobody has a monopoly on policies, on what's going to work. But even when a policy fails, if you can bring a smile or cause somebody's life to be better, even for a day, sometimes that can still help you a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was letting some Syrian refugee women paint my hand in henna and do designs on it, which was something, and they're all laughing and chuckling because they're just so surprised, but it brought a smile. That's a really, really tiny act that doesn't do anything to make their life better in any sort of long-term way.
Right.
But even in a small way, seeing smiles and smiles of joy, even if people forget their issues for a little bit. So I think that's something that I try to remember in my day-to-day life, and something I encourage others to do. And in some ways, aspects that I hope to bring to the campaign.
Awesome. With that in mind, let's go ahead and turn our sights towards our upcoming campaign. With that in mind, how'd you get into D&D? When did you start?
Oh man, so I'm probably the old man of the group. So basically, if anybody has watched Stranger Things, and I think a good number of people have, and watched the kids playing around that time period, that's essentially when I got started. When I was probably about 8 years old, sometime in the early 80s, that we kind of went around. That's when I guess first edition came out. Those are the first rules I played with. And I would get out and basically we would go murder hobo. That's what you do when you're an 8-year-old player, and you had like maybe 5 classes. You didn't have all the subclasses and stuff you had now. Right. It was kind of like you were gonna, I think it was still called Magic User.
Yep.
For the editions I was using, yeah, Magic User, Fighter. I think it was still called Thief. I think they changed it later to Rogue. Yep. You did have some other classes that came in, and so when I started off,
Elf. Back when Elf was a class.
Yeah, exactly. And it was one of those things where, for some reason, people in my school just started playing. I don't know exactly how that groundswell came up, but all of a sudden it was like, oh, it's 8-year-olds. Let's play this in the schoolyard. Everything. I don't know if it was because the books looked neat or whatever it was. So I started playing. Basically like that. And yeah, it was probably typical murder hobo fashion, being a combination of first edition and being, when you're 8, you're not really thinking, everything is role playing because everything is pretend. You're not thinking about grand theater or anything like that. You're just thinking, I am, an elf fighter and I'm going to, fight a troll or whatever. And in your head, you just kind of let that go. As that progressed, I still played off and on throughout it when I was in high school and college, moving up to second edition rules. And at that point, probably not role playing in the style of a complete narrative, but still, all of a sudden you start adding characteristics to your characters based on maybe experiences you had in real life. I still remember back then they had what was called Oriental Adventures, was one of the rule books, and I used to enjoy playing like a samurai and just made them very proud. And we were doing something almost Dragonlance-esque, where they were gonna have to hide in women's clothing. Spoiler if people haven't read a book from the 80s. My character refused, and so I think that's when I first started really getting into the role-playing aspect. They ended up charming him so that he would be able to do it, and he failed his save. And so did that a little bit through college. And then, like I said before, as you get older and you start working professionally, I kind of fell away from the game a little bit. I'd still watch and read it, and I still have some of my old modules and things that were always fun to see. But it was when I was in Turkey that I came back to it. Started playing a little bit with some friends there that we would, whenever I came back home, because I was on the road so much, I would come back and we would do like a campaign, or we would do like a one-off almost, like every 2 months. And so we kind of did that for 2 years. And then Stranger Things, I think really galvanized interest, in particular for me, shifting a little bit because my niece and nephew both liked the show and suddenly were interested in playing. And next thing you know, I'm dungeon mastering, pulling in my hesitant father who's like, oh, okay, well, I'll play it with the kids. And then my mother, who really got into playing a Dorfin fighter, was all, we'll talk about ale. And then my niece and nephew playing it. And so doing that kind of gave me that experience about how this game in so many ways is become cross-generational. Various cultures, and I've always enjoyed that about it. So that's, it's always, it's in some ways, as I mentioned, it's playing pretend to the way you did when you're a kid, but it's also that classic thing we used to do probably even in olden days, sitting around a campfire outside or inside a cave and telling tales of heroism or whatever it is. I think I was mixing trickery and chicanery. I make up my own words sometimes.
That's all right. Shakespeare made up like 300,000 words. You can
well,
make
that's
up
probably
one or two.
Something my character will do from time to time as well. So
that's cool. So Ferry had a good question. It's one that I was going to ask as well. Growing up in the early 80s, and I believe you grew up in a more rural area, did you have to deal with any of the satanic panic stuff?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I grew up in the middle of the Bible Belt, so
okay.
Growing up where I did, it wasn't completely rural, and that it wasn't like I grew up in a community of like 2,000 or 3,000 people, but my hometown was about 50,000 people. But it was also kind of like 4 hours from everywhere. There wasn't a really large city within like an hour or two. So many cities are, especially if you're on the East Coast or even in the Midwest, there's so many cities that are within a couple hours drive. For us to get to like a sizable city that might have like a pro sports franchise or something was always 4 hours away. There was nothing nearby. So yeah, it got wrapped up in that. I remember my mom was worried, like, don't go crazy playing that game and being in the middle of the Bible Belt. There were always conversations about, is it devil worship, or especially with the old edition books, and you had the big devil on there. And I know back in the day, TSR made a decision when it still existed to change the appearance and to rework some of the classes and some of the lore, so as to avoid that kind of issue with parents and with communities who were worried that it was leading their youth astray. I think once my parents actually saw what it was, they were less worried about that. I'm not saying that some people couldn't have taken it too far and become so immersed in their world that something, but it was definitely something that was real. And you definitely heard about it, but it didn't keep people from playing. So, and we never had any incidents like some of the things that largely got made up, or maybe from time to time.
Either made up or inflated.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I started playing probably just a little after you did. I started playing kind of 86, 87-ish, and my gateway drug to the game was I had an older cousin who played, and he's 6 years older than I am. So by the time I was finding out about the game, he was a junior in high school or whatever. And I was in a very advantageous position that he had this massive collection of minis. He was a huge mini buyer and painter and loved that aspect of it, and had all the first edition books. But my uncle had kind of dealt with the, don't let your kid play this game aspect, and basically said, you people are insane, this is fine. So then that carried on then to my mom going, yeah, whatever, don't worry about it. It was deflected a lot for me, but it definitely was, it was around for sure. I think for any of us who were playing in the 80s, there were people who were always kind of looking at it askance as a some type of potential recruitment tool, which is interesting. And so as Ferry brings up in the chat, the movie Mazes and Monsters was a great cultural example of the satanic panic phenomena. And that movie is it's a really interesting historical piece. If you've come to this game a little later, a little more recently, I should say, as far as especially 90s, 2000s, where things are way more accepting most places about this game, Magic the Gathering, Vampire the Masquerade, any kind of role-playing game or Magic-based card game, I think has sort of become a little more understood as just a part of media. And one more thing, I think probably video games helped with that in a lot of ways. It mainstreamed sort of whether it was the first person shooter or other first person games, it sort of mainstreamed an RPG lifestyle, or people could get it in a way that they didn't with tabletop RPGs, and I think it kind of had a spill down effect, maybe a little bit. So you played a lot of first edition, you played a lot of second edition. What have you noticed? Obviously, you had a break there, but in coming back to the game, what have you noticed as being something that you particularly like about now being in a 5e world? Like, what do you like about 5e in comparison to your experiences before?
There are things I like about 5e, but that might not be for me specifically. Okay. And when I think about this and it's kind of funny because when I still play generally races and classes that are more old school traditionally, just because that's kind of where my imagination always went when you had, halflings and elves. But like trying to catch up and understand, like, first of all, just getting like, okay, Asimars and Tieflings and seeing the wide variety of characters that were played, and then trying to wrap my head around even more when you could start playing characters like kobolds and goblins, and I was like, oh, okay, I didn't even know that was an option.
Right.
But I actually kind of enjoying that because it gives a different style of playing for different people. There's certain, I think, races that people just enjoy playing because it's a little more fantastic for them. And I think for some players that really gets them into their role and gets them into the world. So seeing that coming back, I found that to be particularly fascinating because that didn't exist really, not at that level back when I was originally started playing. And the same goes with just how classes have in some ways diversified, become more complex. For both better and for worse. There's parts of me that really likes it. There's parts of me at times that are like, okay, this is too much like a video game, and I'm trying to just maximize my power, which means does everybody follow the same path in order to make their character the strongest it can be? And I'm not really into, for me personally, and that's fine because people have different styles of playing. It's one of the beauties of the game. If you want to get around and you want to go murder hobo and that's what you like to do, go do it. Nothing wrong with it. Just make sure everybody in the party and the DM are all on the same page together.
Right.
For me, I've always liked playing flawed characters, and I think part of that came back from like playing in high school, and one of our teachers was a dungeon master, and he was pretty strict with the rules. So it was you put down your 6 ability scores. He rolled 4 dice, threw out 1, and the first 3 you got, that went in strength.
Right.
Even if you were thinking of playing wizard and you rolled like a 7, you're like, oh no. But you were kind of stuck. So I kind of liked, maybe it was almost like an engineering problem. Like you were constrained by these limitations based on what the fates gave you through the dice. So I still lean towards that style of play, but what I'm happy about with the new additions is I think it really gives players the opportunity to really be who they want to be a little more. So for me, I still like being maybe limited, but for others, I know they really get into having more of that player control over their destiny. And the other part of it, I just think, and this is largely just a result of the resurgence Dungeons and Dragons has had, is just people are much more into role playing now. People are much more into narrative storytelling. And I think that aspect is definitely something that's grown over the past 5 years, 6 years that we've had.
Sure.
5e.
Yeah, it's interesting. Friday brings up in the chat that he's noticed that the vast majority of players under 25 almost never play a human, which I think is vastly different than it's certainly vastly different from what my experience was playing the game, and probably yours as well, because humans just automatically had all of the boosts, right? Like if you had to really want to play something other than a human to not play a human early on. In my experience with the game, it lent itself to so much more versatility in what you could get away with, especially as you were learning the game. Nowadays, all the various character races I think it's balanced in a way that allows for you to engage in that role play aspect more readily when you jump into another class, another race, I should say. So with that in mind, like we both started playing in early adolescence. You know, you were 8, I was 10. The view of the world that anybody has at that age is pretty limited, and I think that the view that a child born in the 70s, raised in the early 80s had was probably even more narrow. How do you take that experience that you've had of traveling the world, meeting people from different cultures, experiencing different nationalities? How do you take that and bring it to the table now in the context of a game that does it is predicated on races and classes, right? Everything you do in the game starts with what race are you and goes to what class are you, and that sort of defines the scope of what you're going to be able to do. At least it does until tomorrow, when my copy of Tasha shows up, and the little bit of teaser that I've seen, because I have avoided all spoilers on it, but the little bit of promo teaser that I've seen is that much of that seems to be being changed. So this conversation may be very dated in less than 24 hours. But with that said, we've had that experience of it's very rigidly defined by race and then class. How has your approach to that or perspective on that changed or not over the years?
That's a tough question and something to think about. I think on the one hand, my real life experiences, when they bring that into me, just understanding that most situations are much more complex than ever. You get a little bit over the kind of Lord of the Rings trope that everybody's good, everybody's evil, good and bad sides, that conflicts are actually much more complex. All sides have flaws. There are going to be situations where, yes, you do define a side as good or evil, and you do fight that. And part of that's the reason you go into a fantasy world to explore that. I think it's a safer way to explore that. But I think from my experience, it usually brings me into questioning and wondering what are the motivations of the people that are maybe helping drive the narrative along, if they're the big bad boss or if there is a conflict between two warring parties, why are they motivated that way, and trying to understand that. Having grown up as a child of the Cold War, things back then tend to be put in a much more black and white era, because it was basically you had two sides. And everything was Rocky IV or something like that. And something like Wolverines, or if you're watching Red Dawn or anything like that. So it was a much more black and white kind of world, and we live in a much more complex world now for a lot of different reasons. And when it comes to inside the game itself, and as far as like races and classes, I think on the one hand, they're definitely trying to avoid some of the problems that maybe they've had in the past. About how that comes out. I think there are tropes that people tend to stick to as far as to what characteristics are like, based on what the characters were like in the first fantasy books. So, if you're a dwarf, you're kind of burly and grumpy, and you like ale, and that could all be true. You can still run with that and have fun, but there might be ways to broaden that in your role playing in the campaign. You might be somewhere, so many people when they play like the higher classes are solely giving like posh British accents if they're into like voice acting, that kind of stuff when they role play. And yeah, again, all well and good. That does kind of, for one reason or another, give a sort of refined element to it, at least for most English speakers in their mind. There's a reason a lot of those casting seems to take place in the UK for so many fantasy movies or TV series. But I think you can move beyond that. I think there's ways to explore it and to maybe surprise people. Maybe, I've seen others comment on this. And so there's other ways that you can do that. And then also, I think it's just part of what kind of campaign do you want to run.
Sure.
In the end of the day, it is you, the dungeon master, and a group of folks getting together to play the game and figure out what they want, what they don't want, what makes people comfortable. And in running with that. And I think that's part of why yes, new books can come out and change rules or establish a new rule set or a new,
Mhm.
but at the end of the day, you know, those are all guidelines, and it's what
Right.
you agree with folks on your table to play and what kind of things that you want to explore. And it's something I look forward to exploring with Finn as he moves forward with his adventure, hopefully,
Hmm.
if he survives session zero. Um, Never know. I still carry a 10-foot pole everywhere because I'm like
Absolutely.
Stephen Colbert in that
Yeah.
one episode where he played with Matthew Mercer, and it's like, yeah, you can still tell when he started playing the game because we're all a little gun shy on everything we
Yep.
find. But
Just probe.
yeah, exactly. So it's like, oh, let me test this out.
Uh-huh.
That was a great episode to see that. Yeah, so I think there's room to explore. Things don't have to be based on race or class. I think there are elements of that are going to exist in every area. You know, if you have traditional areas, halfling village is constantly being raided by goblins or vice versa. But it might be interesting to explain their perspectives. Why are they motivated like that? And then D&D does seem to have become much more multicultural in its own fantasy realm.
Mhm.
And again, I think that's just something that has evolved over time.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's the 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 way I've sort of internalized it is that the idea of all humans are tribal, right? Where it's just sort of baked into our DNA. We recognize those who look like us and readily identify those who don't. And that for many generations was a survival skill. It's not a survival skill any longer. It probably didn't ever need to be, but that's how genetics works. Is you don't necessarily have choices. And I think that when we are at our best, we are acknowledging that it is baked into our DNA. We're recognizing it. Um I've always sort of had a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to the idea of, well, I don't see color, or I don't see sex, or I don't see what like, well, no, you do. You're hardwired to see it. What you mean to say, I hope, is that you don't allow that to be the deciding factor about how you will interact with people. That it is not forming a prejudicial opinion about someone's relative worth. Um, and I think that that's a yeah, I think that's that's something that as a society we're still trying to figure out. Multiculturalism is it is something that people all over the world struggle with, and pluralism is something people struggle with, which I think is good. I think struggling with it is good because it means that we're no longer ignoring it, right? It's no longer quite so hard and fast. Was your experience of getting out of that sort of black and white bubble of good, bad, you know us versus the Russians, all those sort of very binary tropes, was that something that happened when you were a kid? Was it something that developed in high school, college? Obviously, by the time you got into the foreign service, I imagine that you had at least an opening in that perspective.
Yeah, I'd say it's something. It was a combination of genetics and environment. I mean, I think probably somewhere in my internal chemistry, there's things that look at things a certain way, but those were also nurtured by the way I was raised to come in and embrace and learn about people of different cultures or religions, and to not something my parents instilled in me was to respect that there are differences and to not discriminate based on those differences.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's it. Of course, man. When I'm watching, Red Dawn and they're shooting up everybody and Wolverines, I'm all in there. I mean,
Well, yeah.
I don't want to
Yeah.
say there's not that, or there's not the Miracle on Ice or stuff like that.
Sure.
Happens. We all have that, and we all do have some of that. Identifying, whether it's patriotism, whether it's identifying with people from your region or people from your family. People do things for different reasons. I think moving outside and spending as much time out of my native country as I have, that has had me look at things from a slightly different view, because I'm not surrounded by just hearing the view I hit from there. And that was part of my job, is to go out and basically, find out what assistance is, but also to kind of report what this is what people are thinking about on the ground. It's kind of like being a journalist. I just wrote for a newspaper essentially that went back to the government, and and I'd go out and talk to different people and write. And so and then trying not to filter that through my own bias. It's one of the things that we try to do, is like, write facts. Don't write and say, well, I think this. If you have that sentence in there, you just edit that out right away. Just report what people tell you, and report it as them telling you that, rather than that's what actually happened. So I think those type of things have led, for me, I think it was part of like just where I grew up. It was kind of in that genetics. My parents instilled it in me. I remember waving the flag on 4th of July. Obviously joined the Foreign Service, so I did have a sense of duty to my country, and still do. And at the same time, though, I also remember like when the first Glasnost talks were happening between Reagan and Gorbachev, and in my mind, as a I guess probably like a 6th grader or something, thinking about like, wow, what if this can really, bring around peace, was in my head, and the way that it does when you're like 11, 12 years old.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that feeling as well when the Berlin Wall came down.
That was huge.
Wow. And sensing those sense of accomplishments when you actually are able to help end an area. Now, being human nature, new eras will always arise, new issues will always come up.
Right.
But I think all those things kind of made me think about the world, or helped shape how I viewed the world in that way.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I do want to throw out that if anybody in chat has questions for Matt, please feel free to throw them in there and I will ask them. I had an interesting experience growing up. I grew up south side of Chicago, very Irish Catholic neighborhood, and was raised from a very young age around the idea that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. There were several neighborhood bars that ran at minimum money, maybe other things, supporting the boys back in Ireland. Several places where, pictures of the hunger strikers from 81 were the predominant decoration in the place. So I learned that sort of, that history is written by the winners sort of perspective, relatively young, but without a doubt, it took getting older, getting out into the world a little bit more, seeing these various perspectives to sort of understand, oh, it's not as simple as maybe I was led to believe. So I think it's a good perspective for folks to keep in mind. So with that, we do have a couple of chat questions for you. The first comes from Friday, and he wants to know, how has being abroad informed your role playing?
Let's see. It's interesting. I would say that part of it is being abroad, and probably part of it's just being old. That as I started, that when I come back and think about how I role play now, it usually has a lot to do more with narrative than it used to be before. And it has more to do with exploring some of these very questions that we're talking about, along with exploring, or maybe I think I would say with role playing, what it is for me is trying to create images of what I've viewed and witnessed overseas as a result of conflict, and carrying that to the table. It's maybe a safer place for me to do it. Maybe I do it as my own sense of therapy, just like a lot of soldiers. And I don't want to compare my job to what men and women in uniform have done, because their level of risk, we all have a level of risk, and I've been in some tight spots before, but I don't want to make that comparison, just to clarify for folks, but
Sure.
just like my grandfather wouldn't come back really and talk too often about what happened in World War II, I don't really come back and talk about a whole bunch of specifics as much. But in role playing, I think it gives me a safe space to maybe explore that, because it's not a direct correlation, but in a way it allows me to bring some of that experience that I've witnessed and thought about. And then with the empathy I talked about, maybe even try to explain or have characters that kind of whether player characters or NPCs that have gone through that and what that experience is. At times, maybe that's too realistic, because at times I do like to make this fantasy and I can murder hobo with the best of them when I need to.
Yeah, sure.
But in the role playing aspect, I would say that's probably it. It's definitely not accents. I know some people have skill with that, and people see various broadcasts, and they're professional voice actors and others who do this kind of thing. So it's definitely not that. But I would see it for me, probably the uniqueness of the experience of not just having lived overseas or been in areas where conflict happened, but when I did that, I actually lived among local people primarily. Every time. And if I wasn't living among them, I was definitely out among them most of the time, whether it was eating in a field with Afghan farmers, sitting down as they hand harvest wheat with hand tools, which is almost like time traveling. Whether it was just talking with Syrians in Turkey, or living in my neighborhood and having my doorman in Colombia and having conversations about stuff that's going there. So there's always these different experiences that, having been immersed, I think are things that have probably, without even consciously thinking about it, entered my role play more.
How do you bring it to the table when you're DMing?
You know, when I DM, it's funny because most of my DMing has been with my niece and nephew, and so they're younger. Okay. And so when I do that, I was running one other campaign, and we had one session before the pandemic really started to hit. I think when I DM, it's usually I try to bring some humor into it, whether it's usually picking a couple of NPCs along the way that the player characters can develop a relationship with, but it's not a relationship where you're dropping subtle clues about hints to the big bad or anything else that's going along. It's more just there to give like almost comic relief, to give them someone to interact with that's just fun. Because at the end of the day, you can make a D&D campaign, a morality play, or various other things, which we as humans have been doing for so long. But it's also just a fun game, and it's a chance to sit there and do that. So whether it was having, a goblin that ended up tailing along with the party because they just kind of fell in love with her, and the interactions and the voice you could give her, I think was that. With trying to do that a little bit, especially with my niece and nephew, to keep them engaged, because that game is much less role playing and much more on the let's adventure and find treasure and fight monsters. And hey, who doesn't love that? I still do too. I'm like, woohoo, treasure!
Right.
First,
right. There's a reason loot crates work in video games.
So I think whenever I've DM'd, that has been more my aspect, is trying to make sure I know what everybody's playing and what everybody's doing, to make it fun for them. Because I think at the end of the day, when you're playing like a friendly game, and my most successful campaigns have been when groups of friends are around a table and we're all just laughing and having a good time. I think that's what the kind of environment you try to foster.
Sure. So to the extent that you are open with sharing, Fairy would like to know what race and class you are planning on playing in our campaign.
Oddly, I'm not going to be a human after all this conversation earlier. Because I do frequently play humans, but I have stuck with the old, I'm one of the four classes races I always remember: human, elf, dwarf, and halfling, which are the four that I've always played. I am actually going to be a wood elf ranger.
Okay.
So looking forward, his name's Fenn, or that's short for Fenarius, but yes, people call him Fenn. So it'll actually be the first time I've ever played a wood elf.
Okay.
I haven't, might be the first time I've ever actually played a ranger too. Not since I maybe had an archery fighting man back in the day. But so yeah, so that's the character I'm playing. I'm not going to go into too much detail because there are going to be things that come out, and I really hope that people get to join us and you and enjoy the narrative that we're working to create, and then see where the dice take us, and see where the campaign takes us, because it's one of the things, you know, when we all work about backstories and everything, and I do have a backstory for Fenn. But also, I don't know where it's going to end up. And I think that's always part of the joy of doing this style of game, is that I'm not being a Calvinist in my approach to this kind of Dungeons and Dragons. Nothing is predetermined. I don't know exactly how it's going to roam from one area. You know, I don't have an end destination in mind. I have a starting point and what has kind of shaped him, and kind of what he's struggling with internally. But who knows how he gets there, or if he does get there, there might be, you know, what he might, it so often happens, what you might be looking for might not be what you find, but it might be what you needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole idea of, you know, real life is what happens, or experience is what happens when you don't get what you wanted.
Yeah.
Right. That's what experience is, you know, the lesson that I tried to teach my son when I was growing up, or when he was growing up, I guess I was growing up alongside of him in a lot of ways, was that I never learned anything from something I got right the first time. You know, if it went fine, it probably didn't register at all. And it was only in that sort of that challenge that I learned anything and grew at all. So I definitely think that's definitely part of it.
Yeah, we all have to emotionally grow. We all have failings in our life. It doesn't stop when you turn into an adult, and it doesn't stop throughout your life. We're all faced with challenges. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail. Sometimes you're proud of what you did, sometimes you're ashamed. And I think part of that is when you have those moments that are proud, don't just sit on your laurels, see what you can do to still make things better. And when you do things where you didn't succeed, or where you feel a little bit like, I didn't do that well, or maybe you're embarrassed of how you performed or what you even did, and you're like, oh, well, just take that and grow, because that is where growth comes from. And so I agree completely with you, Chris, on that.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how this game, you know, you brought up the idea that this game is a safe space to explore ideas, and, you know, Zuriel threw in chat here that the last character they played in a campaign was a life cleric celestial warlock that was a lot more caring than they consider themselves to be in real life. And I think that is a great thing about this game, right? Is it gives this space where you can take on a persona and role play it and gain some insight. Do you see Fenn as being the kind of character where you are taking on a persona that is vastly different than you? And if not, what kind of character have you played at some point that has done that has been very different than who you are in day-to-day life?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think every character we have has certain aspects of ourselves in them, just because I think there's a reason that we're drawn to that character. Or maybe it's connecting with a specific emotion we have at the time. Maybe you're just mad. You've just had a really crappy year, and you're like, all right, I just want to go smash things. And so
who could have possibly had a crappy year this year?
Yeah, who would have a crappy year? Yeah, this is all going to be like rage-based barbarian campaign. You got to go fight a virus. But along those lines, I think there's aspects of that. I think there are certain part of Fenn's personality that will probably have certain aspects of who I am in it. But the other part of it for me in role playing has often been observations from friends and family and other people around me. So whether it was observing a friend's father and then kind of sort of taking some of his characteristics and putting them into my character, because I respected the way he held himself in a way. And so like, I remember adopting certain characteristics, mannerisms of my friend's dad and incorporating that. So I think there's an element of it that's always you, because we're always in our own headspace. But I also like to look around what I've observed everywhere and try to bring elements of that into who I'm playing. And I think part of that is the idea that a lot of people don't want to play stuff that's too close to themselves, because we do that every day. When we put on our face and act every day, it's just the whole world is a stage and we're merely players. But I think we do enjoy that pretend element. And I think that's definitely strong. And I think that's one of the things that makes the game as incredible as it is, because you do have the rule sets, and that really gives the bones and structure, which I really like. And the dice, who doesn't love the sound of a 20-sided dice rolling, or any of the dice rolling? But also, I mean, whether you see like some kid who's like, I want to be a Superman ogre, and you're like, all right, we'll figure it out, because that's what you want to play, and that's fun. And that was the whole point, is that for that kid, whether you're a 9-year-old kid or whether you're a 59-year-old kid, there are aspects of that you can do. And in my role playing, for myself, there's definitely aspects of myself, but I do try to draw upon my observations from what I've seen. Sometimes I might not even know the person well. It'll just be an image or something that I'm like, that's interesting. Can I explore that? And then to put it in the whole To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch things, for me, it's a big part of putting on somebody else's shoes and then walking in those shoes and trying to act not how I think I should act, but how I think that person would act, while avoiding the just being a jerk type player where you go in and just try to screw stuff up just to screw everything up. I'm not interested in that. To me, that's kind of counterproductive. If you want to play that kind of game and get a whole bunch of people play that, go for it. Have a battle royale. But for me, it's more about exploring the emotional element.
And I think that is a thing that you see come out in role-playing games that you don't necessarily see in other ways, because you're trying to get into it the head of a character, right? But unlike theater, this really is more improv than it is scripted theater by any stretch of the imagination. So you almost default to having to be yourself a little bit, because often, especially as you're learning your character, as you're starting to play your character, you haven't completely figured out their motivations, their lived experiences, those sorts of things. And you inevitably have to bring yourself to the table until you've kind of gotten into the bones of that character a little bit.
Yeah, I think that is part of the beauty of playing a campaign. Like when you do a one-off, I mean, you can role play, but usually you're just picking like one or two character personality tweaks. And again, those are completely fine. I enjoy
them. Oh yeah, for sure.
I probably played, one shots more than I have anything else. I think the beauty of a longer campaign is that you have a general idea of how your character is motivated. It is improv. But improv is not just determined by what the DM and other players do, but also what the dice lead to. But then when a session ends, you do have time to kind of digest it. Just like in real life, after a series of events happens to you, you sit there and think about like, oh my God, what just happened? Not that I was ambushed by orcs in real life, but I mean, like if you had something like that happen, those are the kind of things that I think inform and help your character to develop. But I think it takes that pause after a session is ended for for you to kind of do your homework, so to speak, to kind of think about how the character would respond and all those various things. And so I think that's the part that's kind of, on the one part it's theatrical, on the other part it's game. And when you have that nexus, that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, and you brought up something earlier that I think is an interesting idea, that for you there has been an element of therapy to the game and using it as a tool to sort of explore some of these things. And I was thinking how when you just said, I've never been ambushed by orcs, and my immediate response in my head is, I've been ambushed, never by orcs. Like, but going through that moment in game of having those experiences, I think are a really interesting way of taking these real world experiences that you have had and playing them out. And I wonder if there's I know I respond to this game much differently now, having lived the life that I've lived and having been through the challenges that I've been through. When I was playing this game as a child, it very much was exploring heroism aspirationally, right? Trying on the different masks and clothes that go into behaving in this sort of heroic vein, in that you are trying to, heroes in fantasy are trying to do something for others, right? I like the Joseph Campbell quote of, a hero is somebody who has given themselves for the tribe. And that may be a sacrifice in the literal sense. It may be the willingness to sacrifice, but one way or another, the archetypal hero or heroine is somebody who has been willing to set aside their own comfort to better their tribe. For me, I know, coming from a career of running into burning buildings and all kinds of stuff like that, this game now is a way of sort of thinking about, okay, well, why did I do what I did? It's a very different perspective than it was when I was first trying those things on. And I think that it's a valuable tool that role playing can offer. It is giving us the opportunity to try those things on that we wouldn't otherwise have tried on, and then processing the stuff that we actually did. Friday wants to know if you are going to be doing an accent or a voice.
I will be doing an accent. I don't know if
Does it sound slightly like somebody who grew up in the South and then went to work for the Foreign Service, or
it's not going to be exactly mine.
Okay.
I will say this. I will say this, that I'm taking a different take on an elf accent.
Okay.
So many elf accents are high end and posh, and mine is going to be a little bit different.
Okay.
And so there definitely will be some regional dialect from where I'm from.
Okay.
But it is not a commentary. And this kind of goes back to our earlier conversation of, like, certain races are portrayed certain ways, and have been going back to Tolkien and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is more like, no, this is just an accent. This is just how us people speak, and it doesn't demonstrate anything regarding strength, agility, intelligence, woodsy knowledge, or whatever. It's just how you spoke, because it's where you grew up. And I think trying to do something accent based, I think that's something that, for me, I always like sometimes challenging convention that way. It's more fun to challenge convention that way than to always necessarily play to the stereotype. Although, again, sometimes stereotypes are fun. I mean, like I said, you can be a heavy drinking Scottish dwarf and it's all good.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that there's, like anything, as long as you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, playing within that space can be liberating. It can be exciting. It can be interesting. I think regardless of what you are doing, and this I think also applies to comedy, right? There are great comedians that push a lot of boundaries, right? And that can be a very powerful tool if they know what they're doing and why they're doing it. When it is happening without intention, when it is happening because of sort of implicit heuristics and biases, that may be more problematic, right? It's betraying a lack of understanding as opposed to a desire to challenge another's understanding. And I think you're right when it comes to voices in D&D in particular, probably in fantasy broadly. There are those sort of tropes that get played out, right? The elves are posh, the dwarves are rough, and things like that. When the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter. I grew up in the South Side of Chicago. Every guy, I went to an all guys high school. Every guy that I went to high school with sounded essentially the same. right? We all spoke essentially the same. We all had essentially the same mannerisms. Excuse me. Didn't matter what our individual intelligence, ability, anything was, right? And so I think that's a really interesting take on it, and one that's fun to see play out. Go ahead.
Oh, and it's one of those things too. Again, at least for me personally, as I mentioned earlier, when I'm developing a character, whether it's an accent or mannerisms, I'm often taking inspiration more for something I've seen than thinking. I don't go in thinking I want to try to do a Scottish accent, or I want to see if I can do like a Spanish lisp with corazon, or one, because I would probably screw all those up, even though I have some knowledge of those. But part of it is also like, I'm not thinking about this accent fits this person because they're from this region. What happens for me is I generally think of people who are kind of inspirations for helping create the character. That can be both fictional and non-fictional. Like it could be somebody everybody knows. It can be somebody I just know in life. And I'm like, oh, I would like to draw that bit. Maybe they're, maybe whatever they are, maybe they're very proud and they have a certain haughtiness to their voice that comes out. If you're playing a certain type of character, no matter what race or class they are, that aspect is coming in. And that's not talking about who I'm playing now. I'm not going into that, but just as a general comment for me, I'm usually drawn more towards literary, film, or real life, whether celebrity or whether people next door, inspirations that I kind of draw on that, which help me kind of develop the character more than thinking about, I think they're from this region.
Sure. Yeah, I can understand that. So I've been asking you questions, and chat's been asking you questions for just about an hour now. This is in part about this campaign that we're going to be playing in together. Do you have any questions for me about the adventure ahead?
I know that we've discussed a wide variety of things, and as we're all getting to know each other, and I think I watched, like many others have, and hopefully continue to do so, watching all the various intro and the history. I think a lot of the things that would be my specific questions will probably be unfolded as that, so I don't necessarily want to spoil for myself. But I'm always interested in like what you're looking for with your players that really makes the game easier and manageable for you as a DM, because I know game masters have so many things that they're responsible for, particularly when we're doing a stream as well. So what are aspects that we as players can do to help create Umbranthal, whether it's technical or personal, on the things that we can contribute to in order to make everything successful for you and easier for you as a DM?
Well, first off, I think that the thing that any player at any table, and I consider the DM one more player. I don't consider it a separate. I don't consider it hierarchical, right? It is its own job, in the same way that playing a player is its own gig. There are certain responsibilities that fall within that domain, but for me at least, it is, and I think for many people, it is about the collaborative storytelling, right? So to me then, like good improv, what I look for in players and in a DM, if I'm in the player's chair, is somebody who's prepared to yes and a situation, right? Even if it's not true to your character, think about the fact that something led you to, as your character, something led you to leave the life that you had and pick up and be part of a party. Yeah, right? There's something in your goals, there's something in your needs that says that that collaboration as that your character being a collaborator is important. It's the only way for them to attain what they want to attain. If they didn't want to collaborate, then they would just go do their own thing. And I think that that's important both as characters, as players playing a character, and then also for that character is to have that approach of yes and, right? How do I keep from bringing the flow of this to a halt? It's okay to change the direction, right? It is okay to take the direction that the narrative is headed and say, oh, that's cool. I'm going to add to that. And now I'm going to see how it goes this way. That's the and part, right? Of I'm building off of this. Yes, and is very different than no, but.
Right.
Or, well, actually, and I think that when everybody sits down at the table with that yes and philosophy, players and DM alike, it lends itself to a much more free-flowing game. So that's something I look for, is people who are just willing to approach things with a yes and attitude. And that's not to say that anybody should ever be forced into a position of either in-game sort of character-wise consenting to something that they think is utterly stupid. Like, you should, just like real life, you should be an advocate for yourself. If the fighter, I'm going back to my terminology from forever, fortunately it's still a class, but if your fighter barbarian with an intelligence of 8 comes up with some sort of plan that will get the entire party killed, somebody should say, hold on, let's think about that, right? That's not saying no. That's not stopping the flow of the game. That's engaging with it realistically. By that same token, I don't think anybody should ever be in a position where they have to consent to continuing to play something that is truly uncomfortable or unsettling for them. Yeah. You know, my approach to games in general is that, you know, I have a very few hard and fast rules, and basically, you know, no torture, no sexual violence, no genocide. Like, those are things that I don't want in my games. I don't find them to be themes that I care to explore in this setting. Are they part of the real world? They absolutely are. Are they things that players in one of the games that I am DMing may come across as a thing that has happened in the past? Absolutely. Those things are part of the real world. They are challenges that player characters will come up against. Is it something that I think they should have to live through in the moment? No, I don't think that that's appropriate. I don't think it's what the game, for me, it is not what the game ought to be about. There are other spaces, if that is the fantastical element of life that you want to take on, role play, consider. There's a time and a place for it. I just don't think that a table, for me, the game table isn't the place for it.
Yeah.
So other than that, other than the general yes and perspective, I think the other thing that I come to is, I'm going to come back to what you said earlier, and it's empathy, right? It is, as a player, being empathetic to the other players at the table. While I don't consider the DM to be a hierarchical role, I do think that as a DM, you are in a position of power within the game, whether you choose to view it that way or not, right? The game puts a certain amount of power in a DM's hands, and it's important for the DM to respect the agency of the players, for sure. But I also think that it's especially important for players to engage with one another empathetically and respect the agency of the people they're at the table with, right? And to recognize that your view of the world is your view of the world. It's not a universal view. It's not the view of the world. And the things that we bring to the table in terms of our previous experiences and our our viewpoints are, we need to be attentive to what's happening with the other people at the table, and how our actions are impacting them, either to their character or, more importantly, them as a player, right? The interaction between characters can be hashed out outside of the game sometimes.
Yeah.
The interaction between players is, I think, a more delicate balance to strike, and an important one. So Fast Cat here does have a question for you. Knowing what you know about the other players, and obviously without giving other player info away, is there anyone that Matt is excited to see Fenn meet, given his personality?
Well, I'm willing to sell information on all the other players right away. If you, no, I'm kidding.
He does have a PayPal account, so feel free.
You know, I think one, I'm interested because we have such an interesting group of players that I'm really looking forward to how committed and invested everybody is in, including Chris. It's going to be hard for me to set out on one, and so I don't want to give out too much away, but I know that Fenn will be.
You'd almost think that you were a diplomat.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Shocking. I know. Here, let me try to parse my words. I would say that the first encounter I have, given what the viewers will learn about my character, the first encounter and connection that he has is going to be very important for Fenn. And that will be coming up in a couple weeks. You know, I don't want to give too much away.
Sure.
But
I appreciate that.
So I'm not going to go into detail with that yet, but I know we are having, pre-sessions, and so a relationship of some sort, even if just like a first time you've met somebody type thing, will be taking place. But as far as that, I mean, I'm looking forward to playing with everybody. It was great watching Steph last week. She did a great job in her interview. It was like big shoes they fill for me to fill after what they had said. And so, those are always, whoever follows me will obviously have it easier. Working on those type of things, but it's so hard to pick one, and I don't want to leave anybody out. But based on what Steph said last week, I'm interested in what they bring to the table, as well as others, and I look forward to hearing from the entire team.
Yeah, I have enjoyed I've enjoyed this process already, only because it's a chance to extend what I've already gotten to know about everybody, and sort of start, one, I learn something new every time I talk to people, but also kind of starting to show everybody, like, oh, here's this cool person that I want to play with, right? I want to game with this person. Here's something interesting. Speaking of Steph, they ask, what critical role player are you more like? If you had to identify with one of them, who, whether it's in their style of play or the kind of character they perform as, anything. And then why?
It probably varies based on the type of character I play. The last few campaigns, I've probably been more of a Sam Riegel type, because I was doing more of like humor, whether playing a bard or arcane trickster rogue, that she was very mouthy and sassy. So in that way, the energy level is like there. But I feel like for the coming campaign, it would probably be some kind of combination of Taliesin.
Okay.
Maybe some kind of combination of like where Taliesin is right now.
Okay.
But it's hard to say, because I mean, even to try to say that, I mean, so many of those guys, or that team, is so incredible at what they do. And they all have the ability to play different types, and you can tell certain personality quirks or styles that maybe they lean to. So I don't want to go in there, but I think there's something about his current character and Caduceus that I would probably see myself relating to, but it's hard to pick one. I literally would say that there's parts of Ashley Johnson's character as well. So it's hard for me to say.
Is that just?
I wish I could answer you better.
Sure. No, I think that's a completely reasonable answer. I mean, obviously, the tendency is, of course, to ask anybody in this space, like, oh, who from Critical Role do you think you're most like? And I think that it's an understandable question because they have such a huge audience and it gives people a reference point. Obviously, the flip side of that is every one of them is a professional actor, and everybody I shouldn't say everybody, most everybody involved in this is not. Yeah. We have a couple of folks who have a bit more of an acting background or performance background. I would argue that being a diplomat is being an actor in many cases. It's its own version of improv, right? And we have other folks who have that acting background. But most of us don't. Most of us don't have that as a tool in our tool set. So it's definitely, I think, a game by and for sort of the average Joe and Jane more than not, right?
Yeah.
If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a goblin. Yeah.
What the folks at Critical Role have done is incredible, and the amount of interest they garner just shows the attraction for the game. They are professional actors. I think we all, anybody in this space who enjoys Dungeons and Dragons or other tabletop role-playing games, of all, love what they do. There's a reason that they have the following they do, and I think that's also like something that interactive storytelling and narrative telling is something that we've always done. It's a different sort of art form in a way, and one that we don't have as much space to maybe traditionally explore, but where Dungeons and Dragons and even doing things like this stream will allows us to do that. Because there's stand-up comedy, which is basically tailor-made for neurotics. So you go in and you write everything down and then you hone your material, but you're up there alone. There's improvisational comedy, there's theater, but there are people who do storytelling. There are storytelling events. There's some great ones here that I've gone seen to see storytellings. But there is something about Dungeons and Dragons that is about weaving a collaborative story that is a lot harder to do, or is not as common of an art form, because generally everything else is movies or theater or books. So I think Critical Role has shown where that space is, combined with making it a game that's fun and for all of us who love the fantasy genre. But I also think there is that people have that need sometimes to like not just make a story, but to make a story with others. Because I think that's something probably deep down in our DNA, sitting around after hunting a mammoth or discovering agriculture for the first time and being like, wow, we can make a story about this. And maybe that's kind of when you talk about the big bads and the things that happen. I mean, when you look at mythologies, whether you're looking at Japanese mythology or Maya mythology or Greek mythology, they all have these stories that were probably largely told in an oral tradition. And I think that's what this brings, is a new form of oral tradition storytelling.
I agree. And I think that is an excellent place for us to wrap it up. So thanks, Matt, for jumping in and joining me for this conversation. It's been enjoyable. I can't wait to get to the table and see things play out from there.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And thank you to all of you who jumped in to watch this today and see what we had going. We are going to continue to meet with the folks who are going to be playing in the Umbranthal campaign starting in December. So this coming Wednesday at 4:30 Eastern time, we are going to be meeting with another one of our players, Sarah, to discuss her experience in D&D and her pretty interesting and exciting background as well. So looking forward to that. So please join us for that. Like every channel like this, if you have enjoyed it, please give a follow. Please visit, share what we're doing with folks. We do have a website that you can visit, hp2xp.com, where you can get some articles that are slowly going up about the world and things that are happening in it. You can jump in on our Discord server, all sorts of ways to connect and interact with us. Our campaign is going to go live on December 16th, and we're looking forward to seeing you all there. So with that, have a great night. See you Wednesday. Cheers.